Today we will explore one of the most surprising and least known chapters in the history of medicine: how medieval hospitals used sound and light as instruments of healing, centuries before modern clinical psychology even existed. In this documentary, we will dive into the sensory architecture of Middle Ages infirmaries and discover that what we once judged to be mere superstition was, in fact, a sophisticated understanding of the human body and its responses to the environment. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is an image that repeats whenever we think of medieval hospitals: a dark, dirty room where bodies piled on narrow beds awaited death amidst groans and desperate prayers. It is a powerful image, and it is, to a large extent, a distortion. Because when we look more closely at the documents, the architectural plans, the accounts of chroniclers, and the internal rules of these institutions, something very different begins to reveal itself. Medieval hospitals were not just warehouses for the sick. They were spaces designed with a precise intention, and that intention involved something that modern medicine would only begin to fully understand many centuries later: the therapeutic power of the environment over the body and the mind. To understand this story, we must first go back in time and situate it within its context. Medieval Europe lived under a very particular worldview. There was not, as we know today, a rigid separation between body and spirit, between science and faith, between the material world and the invisible world. To the medieval man, everything was connected. The human body was not seen as an isolated biological machine, but as a microcosm that reflected the order of the entire universe. And illness was not simply an organic dysfunction. It was an imbalance that involved both flesh and soul, both internal fluids and the individual's relationship with the surrounding cosmos. This vision had deep roots. It came from the ancient Greeks, passed through the writings of Roman physicians, and reached Christian Europe filtered by the Arab scholars who preserved and expanded classical knowledge for centuries. At the center of this medical tradition was the theory of the four humours, a system that dominated thinking about health and disease in Europe for over 1,000 years. Developed from the ideas of Hippocrates in the 5th century BCE, before the Common Era, and later systematized by Galen in the 2nd century, this theory proposed that the human body was governed by four fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each of these humours was associated with one of the four elements of the natural world. Blood corresponded to air, phlegm to water, yellow bile to fire, and black bile to earth. Each humour was also linked to a season of the year, a temperament, and specific qualities of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. Health, in this perspective, was not the absence of disease, but the harmonious balance between these four fluids. When something disturbed this harmony, the body became ill, and the physician's task was to restore the lost balance. This was not a vague or merely philosophical theory. It guided detailed diagnoses and concrete treatments. The medieval physician examined the patient's urine, observed the color of their skin, assessed their temperature, and considered a series of external factors: the season, the local climate, diet, sleep habits, and emotions. Each person was understood as possessing a unique humoral composition. A young and robust man would have a natural predominance of blood, making him sanguine, cheerful, and prone to excesses of heat. An elderly woman might have a predominance of phlegm, being colder, calmer, and prone to lethargy. When the humours fell out of balance, treatment sought to correct the excess or deficiency. Bloodletting removed excess blood. Purgatives eliminated bile. Specific diets warmed or cooled the body as needed, and the environment around the patient was a fundamental part of this healing process. It is at this point that the history of medieval hospitals becomes truly fascinating. Because if the environment directly influenced the humoral balance, then the space where the patient was treated was not a secondary detail. It was an active component of the therapy. And the builders and administrators of these hospitals knew this. They designed their buildings not just to house bodies, but to create specific sensory conditions that could contribute to the recovery of patients. The light that entered through the windows, the sounds that echoed through the walls, the temperature of the halls, the aroma of the herbs grown in the medicinal gardens, All of this was thought out and organized with therapeutic purpose. No example illustrates this reality better than the Hôtel Dieu of Paris, considered the oldest hospital in continuous operation in the world. Its foundation is traditionally attributed to Saint Landry, Bishop of Paris, around the year 651 AD of the Common Era, although the first official records of the institution date back to the year 829. Situated on the Île de la Cité, the small island in the heart of the Seine River, the Hôtel Dieu emerged as a place of welcome for all those in need of help. It was not just a hospital in the modern sense of the word. It was a refuge for the sick, but also for the poor, travelers, pilgrims, women about to give birth, and the elderly without families. The very name of the institution revealed its vocation. Hôtel Dieu, which can be translated as Hostel of God, carried within it the idea that that space was an extension of divine charity on earth, a place where care for the body and care for the soul were inseparable. For centuries, the Hôtel Dieu was the only hospital in Paris. Its history follows the history of the city itself, with all its transformations, crises, and reconstructions. In the 12th century, Bishop Maurice de Sully undertook a major renovation of the hospital, which resulted in new buildings completed around 1255. At that time, the building occupied the south side of the Île de la Cité, near Notre-Dame Cathedral, and consisted of 3 large Gothic halls divided by rows of pillars. Vaults protected the structure against the floods of the Seine. The proximity to the cathedral was not accidental. The chapel was the heart of every medieval hospital. The prayers of the faithful were considered the cornerstone of healing. From the 7th to the 19th century, the chapel remained at the center of every French hospital, and the rest of the building extended from it, often in the shape of a cross. This architectural arrangement had a profound meaning. The hospital was not just a medical space, it was a sacred space, where the geometry of the building reflected the geometry of faith. Life inside the Hôtel Dieu followed a rigorous routine that intertwined physical care and spiritual practices. When a sick person arrived at the hospital, they were received in a ceremony aimed at purifying both body and soul. The staff washed their feet and offered them clean clothes. Next, the newcomer was expected to confess their sins, entering the hospital with a clean conscience. There were confessors who spoke German, English, and Flemish to serve foreign travelers and pilgrims who did not know French. Afterward, the patient received a bed or half of one, as overcrowding was frequent. Women were sent to the female halls and men to the male ones. Chaplains visited the sick regularly, heard their confessions, and celebrated Mass. Those who could walk took their meals together. The bedridden received food in their beds. The dying received the last sacraments, and funeral masses were celebrated for the dead. No one was to die alone. When death approached, the entire community gathered around the bed to pray and sing. And it is precisely at this point that sound takes the stage as the silent protagonist of this story. Because in the medieval hospital, sound was not a casual element. It was a constant, deliberate, structured presence. The day in the large hospitals was rhythmicized by the 7 canonical hours of the divine office: matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, prime, terce, sext, and none between 6 in the morning and noon, vespers and compline at nightfall. Each of these hours was marked by prayers, psalms, and chants, and the primary of these chants was Gregorian chant, that singular form of sacred music that had developed in Western and Central Europe during the 9th and 10th centuries. Gregorian chant is, by definition, a form of monody, a single melody sung in unison without instrumental accompaniment. It does not possess the precise and regular rhythm of modern music. Its notes rise and fall in fluid undulations, without rhyme or fixed meter. It is sung in Latin, and its melodic lines have a quality that many describe as ethereal, capable of transporting the listener to a state of deep contemplation. For the medieval world, this chant was not entertainment. It was prayer made sound. It was the human voice raised to the plane of the sacred. Pope Gregory the Great, who lived between the years 540 and 604, is traditionally associated with the organization and promotion of this musical form, and medieval art frequently portrays him receiving the gift of song from a dove, the symbol of the Holy Spirit. Benedictine monks following the rule of St. Benedict incorporated Gregorian chant as a central element of their daily life, dedicating between 6 and 8 hours a day to this practice. Now, what happens when this chant echoes inside a medieval hospital? To answer this question, we must consider the acoustics of the spaces where these chants were intoned. The great halls of the Hôtel Dieu were not ordinary rooms. They were vast vaulted spaces built of stone, with very high ceilings and thick walls. The Hospital of Tonnerre, for example, built around 1300, had a great hall nearly 90 meters long and 18 meters wide, covered by a barrel-shaped wooden vault. In Angers, the hospital built between 1153 and 1184 was divided into 3 naves by pillars with stone vaults. At the Hôtel Dieu de Beaune, founded in 1443, the Hall of the Poor, Sala do Pobre, measured 50 meters long by 14 wide and 16 high, with a painted wooden ceiling in the shape of an inverted ship's keel. In these monumental spaces, sound behaved in a very particular way. The hard surfaces of stone and wood created long, enveloping reverberations. A Gregorian chant intoned in unison by a group of male or female voices was not simply heard, it was felt. The sound waves traveled along the walls, reflected off the vaults, multiplied and merged, creating an acoustic field that enveloped the entire space and all the bodies within it. This sound experience was not accidental. The architecture of medieval hospitals was a direct inheritance from the architecture of churches and cathedrals, buildings designed over centuries to amplify and sustain liturgical chant. The vaults functioned as natural resonance chambers, prolonging each note, softening transitions, and creating what modern acousticians call a long reverberation time. This effect was ideal for Gregorian chant, whose long, fluid musical phrases benefited from a space that allowed notes to overlap gently. The result was a soundscape of immense depth and beauty that filled the space without being aggressive, enveloping listeners without overwhelming them. For a bedridden patient, unable to move, this soundscape was the very horizon of their sensory world. Modern science is beginning to understand what medieval monks practiced intuitively more than 1,000 years ago. Research conducted by Alan Watkins, a neuroscientist at Imperial College London, demonstrated that Gregorian chant has the capacity to reduce blood pressure and decrease levels of anxiety and depression in those who hear it. A study conducted in 2012 by the School of Nursing at the University of São Paulo revealed that Gregorian chant helped reduce anxiety in mothers with hospitalized children. The American Heart Association found that patients with coronary artery disease who practiced meditation and chanting had rates of heart attack, stroke, and death nearly 50% lower compared to those who did not adopt these practices. Other studies suggest that music can stimulate the production of endorphins in the brain, facilitate communication between the cerebral hemispheres, and even create new neural pathways. But perhaps the most extraordinary case connecting Gregorian chant to health comes from an episode in the 1960s, when the French physician and hearing specialist Alfred Tomatis was called to investigate a mysterious problem in a Benedictine monastery in southern France. About 90 monks who for centuries had maintained a rigorous routine of few hours of sleep and long working days began to show alarming symptoms. They were exhausted, irritable, lethargic, and increasingly susceptible to illness. The more they slept, the more tired they became. Several doctors were called, and none could identify the cause. Tomatis, upon investigating the problem, discovered that as part of a modernization effort, following the Second Vatican Council, the monks had stopped their daily practice of Gregorian chant, which lasted between 6 and 8 hours a day. Tomatis concluded that the chant functioned as a way to recharge the central nervous system and the cerebral cortex. Without it, the monks were literally out of energy. When the chant was reintroduced, the community progressively returned to normal. Within a few months, nearly all had resumed their habitual activities, their prayers, and their rigorous work schedule. This episode is revealing because it tells us something that the builders of medieval hospitals already sensed, that sound is not just an acoustic phenomenon that passes through the ears and disappears. It is a physical force that penetrates the body, affects biological rhythms, and alters physiological states. And when that sound is Gregorian chant, with its specific frequencies, fluid melodic patterns, and meditative quality, the effects can be profound. In medieval hospitals, patients had no choice but to listen. They were immobile in their beds, enveloped by that stone architecture that amplified and prolonged every note. The chant reached them not as an option, but as an environment. It was the air they breathed, transformed into vibration. And this vibration, according to the humoral view of the body, had the power to restore lost balances, calm agitated humors, and bring order to the internal chaos that disease represented. But sound was not the only sense mobilized by medieval hospital architecture. Light played an equally important role, and here again we must abandon our modern assumptions and open ourselves to a very different understanding of what light meant in the medieval world. For us, light is primarily a physical phenomenon, composed of photons traveling at different wavelengths. To the medieval man, light was something much richer and more laden with meaning. It was a direct manifestation of the divine presence. The Gospel of John states that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. The Christian theological tradition, from St. Augustine to St. Thomas Aquinas, developed a true metaphysics of light, in which luminosity was not just a symbol, but a real participation in the nature of the divine. To build a space bathed in light was, from this perspective, to build a space permeated by grace. The stained glass windows, vitrailles that adorned the hospital chapel windows, were therefore not mere decorative elements. They were light filters that transformed raw solar radiation into colored beams, each with specific qualities believed to have effects on the body and the soul. This idea was not born in the Middle Ages. Its roots go back to ancient Egypt, where temples were built with colored fabrics over openings to filter sunlight, and to ancient Greece, where Hippocrates had already noted connections between colors and physiological processes. In the tradition that reached medieval Europe, each color was associated with elemental and humoral qualities. Red, linked to fire and heat, stimulated vitality and blood. Blue, associated with water and cold, promoted calm and reduced inflammation. Green, the intermediary, was considered a balancer. Yellow, linked to air, cheered the spirit and facilitated digestion. When sunlight passed through a medieval stained glass window, it did not just produce a beautiful image of saints and biblical scenes. It bathed the hospital interior with specific chromatic hues. In the Hall of the Poor, at the Hôtel Dieu de Beaune, for example, the stained glass windows of the chapel at the far end of the hall filled the space with a serene and supernatural luminosity that modern visitors still describe as otherworldly. Patients, lying in their beds with red canopies, could watch Mass without leaving their beds, immersed in this filtered light that changed in intensity and tone as the sun moved through the sky throughout the day and the seasons. In the morning, the light might have a colder bluish tone. At noon it became more intense and golden. At sunset, it turned red. Each of these variations corresponded, within humoral logic, to different therapeutic qualities. The Islamic scholar Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, who lived between the years 980 and 1037, had already described in his Canon of Medicine the therapeutic effects of exposure to sunlight, stating that warm sun helped treat everything from flatulence and asthma to hysteria, and that sunlight invigorated the brain. This tradition of knowledge, which flowed between the Arab world and Christian Europe through translations and exchanges, informed medical practice in medieval hospitals. The doctors and caregivers of these spaces did not use the terminology of modern chromotherapy, but they operated within a conceptual system that recognized the ability of colored light to influence the body's internal processes. The light passing through the stained glass was not seen as something passive. It was an active agent of healing, capable of penetrating the skin, warming or cooling the humors, and restoring lost balance. It is important to note that this integration between architecture, sound, and light was not the result of a single design decision. It was the accumulated product of centuries of practical experience and a worldview that saw the world as an interconnected whole. Medieval hospitals were run by religious orders, and the people who cared for the sick were, for the most part, monks, nuns, and lay brothers. who had dedicated their lives to the service of the poor and the infirm. In the Hôtel Dieu of Paris, at least 100 people worked to serve between 400 and 500 patients, distributed across 300 beds. The sisters and novices not only cared for the patients, but also washed more than 900 sheets a week, prepared medicines in the laboratory, grew herbs in the medicinal garden, and participated in all the hours of the divine office. The routine of chants, prayers, and physical care formed a continuous cycle that structured the entire day and created for the patient an environment of regularity and predictability that, in itself, had therapeutic value. The regularity of sound and light rituals created what we might call today a therapeutic temporal structure. The medieval patient, immersed in this environment, had their day organized not by the clock, which did not yet exist in its modern form, but by the rhythm of prayers and chants. Matins at midnight marked the passage into a new day. Lauds announced the approach of dawn. Prime, terce, sext, and none punctuated the hours of the morning and early afternoon. Vespers and compline led into the night. Each of these moments was accompanied by specific chants, by lights that changed as the sun moved, and by the aromas of incense and herbs. The patient did not need to know the time. Their body recognized the rhythms, and this recognition, this synchronization between the internal rhythms of the organism and the external rhythms of the environment, is something that modern chronobiology identifies as fundamental to health. Contemporary science knows that the human body operates based on circadian rhythms, cycles of approximately 24 hours that regulate vital functions such as sleep, body temperature, hormone production, and immune activity. These rhythms are synchronized by external signals called Zeitgebers, a German word meaning time-givers. Light is the most powerful Zeitgeber, but regular sounds and social routines also play this role. In medieval hospitals, patients were immersed in an environment that provided all these signals consistently. The natural light filtered by stained glass changed throughout the day, signaling to the body the passage of hours. The chants of the canonical hours provided regular acoustic temporal markers. Meals, care, and prayers punctuated the day with predictability. Without knowing it, medieval caregivers were providing their patients with exactly the type of environment that modern medicine recognizes as ideal for regulating biological rhythms and promoting healing. This insight gains even more depth when we consider what modern neuroscience has discovered about the effects of sound on the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system controls involuntary functions such as heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, and the stress response. It is divided into two branches: the sympathetic, which prepares the body for action and fight or flight, and the parasympathetic, which promotes rest, recovery, and digestion. Chronic illness, pain, and anxiety tend to keep the sympathetic system in a state of hyperactivity, which impairs the body's ability to heal itself. Slow contemplative music with low frequencies and non-pulsating rhythms such as Gregorian chant has demonstrated in studies the ability to activate the parasympathetic branch, reducing heart rate, lowering blood pressure, relaxing muscles, and creating physiological conditions favorable to recovery. In medieval hospitals, patients were exposed to this parasympathetic stimulation for hours on end, day after day. Not as a delimited therapeutic session with a programmed start and finish, but as a constant environmental condition. The chant was not something that was turned on and off. It was part of the sonic fabric of the space. It echoed through the vaults during the hours of the office, filled the intervals with reverberations that slowly dissolved, and returned in regular cycles throughout the day and night. For a body weakened by disease, this continuous sonic immersion could have significant cumulative effects, keeping the nervous system in a state of relative calm that facilitated natural healing processes. We must also consider the psychological effect of this experience. The medieval patient lived in a world where disease was often associated with sin, where death was a constant presence, and where the fear of eternal damnation was real and palpable. In this context, being in a hospital that was simultaneously a sacred space, where masses were celebrated daily, where the chanting of psalms echoed through the walls, and where the light filtered by stained glass seemed to emanate from paradise itself, offered a type of comfort that went far beyond the physical. The patient was not simply being treated. They were being embraced by an environment that told them, in every sound and every ray of light, that God was present, that there was hope, and that they were not abandoned. This sense of security and belonging is something modern psychology recognizes as fundamental to healing. Psychological stress compromises the immune system. Hope, trust, and the feeling of being cared for strengthen it. The hospices de Beaune offer perhaps the most complete and best-preserved example of this philosophy of integrated care. Founded in 1443 by Nicolas Rolin, Chancellor to the Duke of Burgundy, and his wife Guigon de Salins, the Hôtel Dieu de Beaune was explicitly conceived as a palace for the poor. Europe had just emerged from the 100 Years' War, and the Burgundy region had been devastated by bands of stray soldiers who continued to loot and destroy the countryside, causing misery and famine. Rolin and his wife created a hospital intended to welcome the poor, the sick, the elderly, orphans and pregnant women, offering them free care funded by donations of land and vineyards that the couple made to the institution. The building Rolin commissioned is a masterpiece of flamboyant Gothic architecture. Its polychrome roof of glazed tiles, with geometric patterns in red, brown, yellow and green, became a symbol of Burgundy. But the true genius of the project lies within. The Hall of the Poor, with its 50 meters of length, was the central space of the hospital. 30 beds with red canopies lined up in 2 rows along the walls. Each bed was designed to accommodate 2 or 3 patients, who also had a chair, a bedside table, and a chest for personal belongings. At the back of the room, a chapel allowed patients to attend Mass without having to leave their beds. The chapel's stained glass windows flooded the space with colored light, and the exposed wooden ceiling, painted and ornamented with sculptures, created an acoustic that amplified and enveloped the sounds of the liturgy. The Polyptych of the Last Judgment, a work by the Flemish painter Rogier van der Weyden, adorned the altar and reminded everyone, patients and caregivers alike, of the ultimate destiny of the human soul. The hospital pharmacy was another essential space. Equipped with wooden cabinets containing a vast collection of ceramic and glass jars, it reflected the importance given to the preparation of medicines from herbs and natural substances. The nuns who managed the hospital cultivated a medicinal garden where they grew plants used to make ointments, potions, and poultices. These herbal remedies were an integral part of the treatment, complementing the therapeutic environment of sound and light with pharmacological interventions based on knowledge accumulated over centuries of practice. The integration between architecture, liturgy, and medicine, seen in the hospices de Beaune and the Hôtel Dieu of Paris, was not exclusive to France. Throughout Christian Europe, hospitals followed similar patterns. In medieval England, 980 hospitals have been identified, most founded between the 11th and 13th centuries. In Italy, cities like Rome and Florence had dozens of institutions each. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Byzantine Hospital of the Pantocrator in Constantinople had as many as 21 physicians, 46 nursing assistants, and 6 pharmacists. In all these places, the chapel was the center of the building. Liturgy was part of the treatment, and the sensory environment was designed with therapeutic intent. The Knights of St. John, the Knights Hospitaller, a military hospital order founded during the Crusades, built impressive infirmaries at their headquarters in Rhodes and later in Malta. The Malta Infirmary, completed in 1578, featured a great hall over 150 meters long, 9 meters wide, and 9 meters high, free from drafts and excessive solar glare, equipped with the unusual luxury of 300 individual beds. This space, one of the largest interiors in Europe at the time, was designed to create ideal conditions of ventilation, light and sound for patient recovery. The Knights employed physicians, surgeons, apothecaries and lay nurses, and maintained standards of care that were exceptional for the period. Over the centuries, as modern science developed, the tradition of medieval hospitals was gradually replaced by a model of medicine based on empirical observation, controlled experimentation, and knowledge of anatomy and physiology. The theory of the 4 humours was challenged and eventually abandoned. The relationship between body and spirit, which the medieval hospital treated as inseparable, was progressively severed. the modern hospital became a space of science, not of prayer. The chapel was removed from the center of the building. Gregorian chant was replaced by aseptic silence or the noise of machines. Natural light filtered by stained glass gave way to fluorescent artificial lighting. For a long time, these changes were seen as pure and simple progress, the victory of reason over superstition. But in recent decades, something curious has been happening. Modern medicine has begun to rediscover, under new guises and with new terminologies, many of the practices that medieval hospitals already employed. Music therapy has become a recognized discipline, used in hospitals to reduce anxiety, pain, and stress in patients with various conditions. Chromotherapy and phototherapy are applied in the treatment of disorders such as seasonal depression, neonatal jaundice, and certain dermatological conditions. Environmental psychology studies how the architecture of healthcare spaces affects patient recovery, and the results consistently point to the importance of natural light, noise reduction, and the presence of natural elements. Modern hospitals are being designed with indoor gardens, large windows that allow sunlight to enter, and acoustic systems that minimize aggressive noise. Chronobiology, as mentioned, has demonstrated the importance of circadian rhythms for health and recovery. Recent studies reveal that patients in intensive care units who are exposed to regular cycles of light and darkness recover faster than those kept under constant artificial lighting. Psychoneuroimmunology, the field that studies the interactions between the nervous system, the immune system, and psychological states, has confirmed that stress, fear, and isolation impair the body's ability to fight infection and heal, while hope, social support, and a sense of security strengthen it. Each of these modern discoveries echoes, in a surprising way, the practices of medieval hospitals. This does not mean, evidently, that we should idealize medieval medicine. Hospitals of that time faced serious problems. Overcrowding was chronic. At the Hôtel Dieu of Paris in the 16th century, as many as 3,500 patients were crowded into just 1,200 beds. Mortality rates were very high, reaching 20% or more. Hygiene conditions, despite the efforts of the nuns who washed hundreds of sheets a week, were often precarious. Epidemics devastated infirmaries. The understanding of disease was limited, and many treatments were ineffective or even harmful. Excessive bloodletting weakened already frail patients. The lack of knowledge about the transmission of contagious diseases meant that patients with different conditions were often placed side by side. Medieval medicine had deep flaws and caused real suffering. What this documentary proposes is not a naive glorification of the past, but a more honest and complete recognition of what these hospitals actually were. They were not just the dens of filth and death that the popular imagination portrays. They were complex spaces, designed with intentionality, where a millennial tradition of knowledge about the human body and its relationship with the environment was applied in the best way possible within the limits of what was known at the time. And within that tradition, there were profound intuitions that modern science is now confirming. The idea that sound can affect the nervous system and promote healing, the idea that light has therapeutic properties that go beyond simple illumination, the idea that the physical environment is an active component of the recovery process rather than a mere passive setting. The idea that care for the body and care for the emotional and spiritual state of the patient are inseparable. When we hear a Gregorian chant echo through the vaults of an ancient cathedral, we are hearing more than music. We are hearing the voice of a civilization that understood in its own way something fundamental about human nature, that the body is not an isolated machine, but a living organism that responds to the world around it, that the sounds that penetrate our ears do not disappear without a trace, but resonate in our tissues, in our nerves, in our most intimate rhythms, that the light touching our skin is not just visual information, but an energy that interacts with our physiology in ways we are only beginning to understand, and that the space where a sick person is treated is not neutral, it is part of the cure or part of the disease. The builders of medieval hospitals knew this, not with the language of neuroscience or chronobiology, but with the language of humors, elements, and the theology of light. Their stone vaults were resonance chambers for voices that healed, Their stained glass windows were light filters that sought to restore the body's balance. Their liturgical routines were zeitgebers that synchronized the biological rhythms of patients with the rhythms of day and night. All this was done within a belief system that we today consider outdated. But the effects these systems produced on the human body were real. And when modern science rediscovers these effects and validates them with instruments that medieval people could never have imagined, something remarkable happens. The past and the present meet. And we discover that, despite everything that has changed, some truths about human nature remain constant throughout the centuries. The Hôtel Dieu of Paris still exists. Rebuilt between 1867 and 1878 as part of Haussmann's urban reforms, it today occupies the north side of the Notre Dame Square, just a few meters from the cathedral. It functions as a public hospital under the administration of the Hospitals of Paris, Assistance Publique, Hôpitaux de Paris. Its modern corridors are efficient and functional. But if you walk through them with attention, as did a sound artist who visited the hospital to record its contemporary sounds, you might notice something curious. Echoes that seem to come from another time, a resonance that does not belong only to the present. Because in that place, for nearly 14 centuries, human voices sang to heal. And the stone, as those who listen carefully say, still remembers. The hospices de Beaune also remain standing. Transformed into a museum in 1971, when a modern hospital was built on the outskirts of the city, they receive visitors from all over the world who come to admire their polychrome roofs, their stained glass, their Hall of the Poor, and the Polyptych by Rogier van der Weyden. The medicinal herb garden was recently replanted as a contemporary tribute to the botanical tradition of the hospital sisters. And every November, the hospice's wine auction continues to raise funds for healthcare, keeping alive a tradition of charity that dates back to 1443. The history of medieval hospitals and their healing practices through sound and light is not an antiquarian curiosity. It is a mirror, reflecting questions that remain deeply relevant to modern medicine and society. How do we design the spaces where people are treated? What role does the sensory environment play in recovery? How do we integrate care for the body with care for the mind and emotions? How do we honor the dignity of the patient, not just as the carrier of a disease, but as a complete human being who needs beauty, meaning, and hope as much as they need medications and procedures? These questions have no simple answers, but by looking back at those infirmaries lit by stained glass and filled with chants, we find not a primitive past to be discarded, but a tradition of wisdom to be rediscovered, a tradition that reminds us that healing is more than repairing a mechanism. It is restoring harmony. It is returning to the body and the soul that balance that the ancients called health, and that we, with all our technologies and advancements, still seek to achieve. And so the melody continues. It crosses centuries, echoes in ancient stones, resonates in modern studies, and reminds us, gently but insistently, of something we perhaps should never have forgotten. That sound heals, that light heals, that the space where we are is not indifferent to what we feel, and that in the depths of history there is always something more to be discovered by those willing to listen with attention. If this journey through the silent corridors of medieval hospitals has sparked your curiosity, if you felt that vibration connecting the past to the present, then consider turning that interest into companionship. Subscribe to the channel to follow more investigations like this one, where each episode is an open door to a world we thought we knew, but which still has so much to reveal to us. Leave a comment sharing which aspect of this story surprised you the most. Perhaps it was the power of Gregorian chant over the nervous system, or the sophistication of stained glass as therapeutic light filters, or simply the discovery that those hospitals were much more than we imagined. Each comment is one more note in this conversation we are building together, and each like is a sign that it is worth continuing to explore the most unexpected corners of history. We'll see you in the next episode.